Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are tackling a really critical and, let's be honest, very complex topic.
Very complex.
We're looking at Islamic texts and how they talk about bondspersons, concubinage, and this sits at a really difficult intersection of, theology, history, and modern human rights.
It really does. And for you listening, I think the most important thing we can do right at the start is give you a clear map. Our goal here isn't to judge, but to understand.
Right.
And to do that, we have to separate three different layers. First, the textual content. What do the verses actually say, literally?
Okay.
Second, the historical context. What was the world like in the 7th century
Right.
when these texts were revealed?
And third,
the modern interpretation. So how does scholarship today deal with all of this?
and right at the center of this whole thing is one specific phrase, a core Quranic term we're going to see over and over. Malakat aminukum.
Yes. Usually translated as what your right hands possess. And we have to be precise here. Historically, legally, this term refers to bondspersons, almost always acquired as captives of war.
So it's a specific legal category.
It's a very specific legal designation. And crucially, the texts always keep it separate from the category of wives or zawjat. That distinction is the entire foundation for understanding how this legal framework operated.
Okay, so let's start with the texts themselves, where the rules are first laid out. We can look at Surah 4, verse 3, An-Nisa.
The women, right. The context of this verse is about guardianship, justice, and the rules around polygyny.
It's the famous verse that permits marrying up to 4 women.
It is, but with a huge condition. It says if a man fears he cannot be just and equitable to 4 free wives, he has to stick to 1, or he may turn to what your right hands possess.
Okay, that immediately raises a question for me. How is turning to a bondsperson a way to avoid injustice? That sounds counterintuitive.
It does to us now, but it's a purely legal distinction from that time. A free wife had a whole set of legally enforceable rights. A dowry, equal financial support, equal time, major obligations.
And a bondsperson didn't have those same legal claims.
Fewer of them, yes. So for a man who couldn't meet that high bar for multiple free wives, the relationship with a bondsperson was seen as, and I'm quoting the legal logic, less prone to injustice, because the formal obligations were fewer.
Right, that clarifies the legal thinking at least. Now moving on to another verse in that same surah, 4.24, this one is about who you can't marry.
Yes, it lists the prohibited categories of women for marriage. It says you cannot marry women who are already married. The term is usanat,
Except...
with one major exception, female captives of war.
Wait, hold on. So the act of capture itself could legally dissolve a woman's existing marriage?
In the context of 7th century law, yes. If a woman was captured and her husband remained in enemy territory, her prior marriage was considered legally void under the new authority.
That is a massive legal move.
It is. It changed her entire status and, after a waiting period, made her eligible for a new relationship with her captor. It was a reflection of how war restructured legal realities.
Okay, so that establishes who qualifies. What about the legality of the physical relationship itself? I know Surah 23 verses 5 and 6 are often brought up here.
Right, Al-Mu'minun. The context is a description of successful believers, and it says they guard their chastity.
From everyone.
From everyone except their wives and what their right hands possess.
So by placing them side by side, it makes both relationships legally permissible.
Precisely. It establishes concubinage as a sanctioned relationship, completely distinct from fornication or zina, which was a serious crime.
And just to round out the textual basis, there's a specific verse for the Prophet Muhammad, right, in Surah 33.
Yes, verse 50. It outlines privileges specific to him, and it includes those whom your right hand possesses from what Allah has returned to you of captives. It just reinforces that the entire concept was directly tied to the outcomes of war.
So we've seen the texts. Now we have to do that zoom out you mentioned. Put this all into its historical context, because applying 21st century norms here without that lens is, well, it's a mistake.
It's impossible. You have to understand that in the 7th century, slavery wasn't an exception. It was the global economic infrastructure.
We're talking about the big empires of the day.
Exactly. Byzantium, Persia, it was everywhere. And it was a universal norm in other traditions too. Jewish law in Deuteronomy has specific rules for female captives. The epistles of Paul in early Christianity instruct slaves and masters on their duties.
So the Quran wasn't introducing this practice into the world?
Not at all. It was encountering a pre-existing and frankly brutal and chaotic system. The scholarly consensus is that the Quran's rules were there to regulate and restrict it, not invent it.
And the goal was gradual reform.
Gradual reform, a concept known as tadrij. The idea was that immediate abolition would cause a total societal collapse, probably mass starvation for the people you just freed with no system to support them.
So if the goal was reform, what were the specific changes? How did the rules start to elevate the status of these individuals from just property to something more?
Well, the changes were profound. First, the source was limited. Slavery could only come from legitimate warfare. Kidnapping or enslaving free people was made illegal.
Okay.
Second, it banned some of the worst existing abuses. Surah 24 explicitly forbids forcing bondswomen into prostitution for the master's financial gain, which was apparently very common before Islam.
That's a huge protection. But the really big one, the one that seems to change the whole structure, is the Walad status.
The Walad, or mother of the child. This is, you could argue, the system's built-in self-destruct mechanism.
How did it work?
If a master fathered a child with his bondswoman, she immediately gained this new status. She could no longer be sold to anyone.
Okay, so she's protected.
And upon the master's death, she was automatically free.
Wow. So the master's own family life becomes a vehicle for her freedom.
Exactly. And, maybe even more importantly, the child of that relationship was born completely free and legitimate, with full inheritance rights equal to any children from a free wife.
That's a radical integration strategy. It prevents a permanent slave class from forming over generations.
It does. It basically ensures a path to freedom and integration for the descendants.
What about day-to-day treatment beyond these big legal statuses?
The ethical commands were very strict. There are sayings from the Prophet like, feed them what you eat, clothe them with what you wear, and even more pointedly, they are your brothers and sisters.
So a humanizing element.
A very strong one. And on top of that, freeing a slave or manumission was made one of the most virtuous acts you could do. It was the way to expiate major sins, like if you broke a serious oath or even committed accidental homicide.
So if you put it all together, limiting the source, expanding the exits, it really does look like a long-term strategy.
That is the mainstream scholarly argument, yes. They see it as a managed, pragmatic, long-term abolitionist project designed to dismantle the institution without destroying the society in the process.
Okay, that historical logic makes sense for the 7th century, but let's bring it into today, because this is where the real tension lies. What are the primary concerns that critics raise now?
The number one issue, without a doubt, is consent and autonomy.
Right.
Modern ethics are built on this, and critics argue that a captive woman, by definition, cannot freely consent to a sexual relationship with the person who holds her captive.
So from a modern perspective, it's viewed as institutionalized sexual exploitation.
Or, in the strongest terms, as legalized rape. And beyond that is just the fundamental principle of ownership. The idea of owning another human, no matter how well you're required to treat them, is just. It's seen as inherently immoral today.
And there's a theological challenge in there too, isn't there?
A huge one. People ask, why would a timeless, all-knowing God permit slavery at all, even temporarily? By creating rules for it, doesn't the text accidentally solidify it, making it harder for later generations of literalists to let go?
That is the core dilemma.
It is. It's that tension between a specific historical ruling and a timeless ethical ideal.
So how do Muslim scholars today navigate this? I imagine there isn't one single answer.
No, there are two main schools of thought.
Yeah.
The most dominant, the mainstream one, is what you could call the trajectory or abolitionist school.
Okay, and their argument is?
Their argument is based on the higher objectives of Islamic law, the maqasid, things like justice, freedom, dignity, preserving life. They argue that these are the true, eternal goals of the Quran.
So they would say that modern abolition isn't a rejection of the Quran.
They'd say it's the fulfillment of the Quran's highest purpose. They see the specific rules about slavery as temporary, time-bound regulations for a 7th century problem. And they point out that the global Muslim world, through consensus in bodies like the OIC, has formally agreed to abolish it. That agreement, or Ahd, is binding.
Okay, so that's the mainstream. What's the other view? The more literalist one?
That's the classical literalist school. Historically, this view held that since the Quran's verses are eternal, the practice is theoretically still lawful, but only if the exact conditions are met again, a legitimate war that results in captives.
And they saw it as a consequence of war?
Yes, often framed as a more merciful alternative to executing all prisoners of war.
But this is the view that has been used by extremist groups recently.
Tragically, yes. Groups like ISIS seized on these literalist interpretations to try and revive slavery, arguing that to abandon it is to abandon the Quran. A view that is, I must stress, overwhelmingly rejected and condemned by virtually all global Muslim scholars today.
And in the end, the global consensus has moved far beyond this.
It has. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, Article 4, bans all forms of slavery, period. It's a crime against humanity. The prevailing view today is that being a faithful Muslim means upholding human dignity and freedom. It means treating those historical verses as documentation of a social reform that has now reached its final abolitionist conclusion.
So this deep dive really has been about balancing regulation and reform, history and modern ethics. We saw texts that stepped into a brutal pre-existing system and introduced some really revolutionary limits.
And a clear trajectory toward freedom. And we've established that the dominant view today is that the spirit of justice and mercy in those texts is best fulfilled by global abolition. It means seeing those specific legal rulings as, contextual and temporary.
So the challenge for contemporary Muslims is still that reconciling specific time-bound rulings with the timeless ethical goals of dignity and freedom.
It is.
So here's a final thought for you to take away. We've explored how these texts try to bring ethical boundaries to the chaos of 7th century slavery, setting it on a path to freedom. The tension that remains is this. When an ancient text pushes for social reform through gradualism, does its ultimate success, abolition, make those earlier regulatory verses obsolete? Or are they eternally applicable if those very specific historical conditions, like a legitimate war with captives, ever came back? That question right there is at the very heart of modern Islamic jurisprudence.